Welcome to the 10th and the last lecture in the series of political thought on the Just Rebellion. Thank you for lasting the pace this long. From my point of view, it's been a very rewarding course. The interest and the very perceptive comments of the entire group have made it very worthwhile for me. So I hope at least you found it an interesting course. One of the things that we really didn't cover, and this is something that needs to be remedied in future iterations of this course, is the question of rebellion by women. Of course, also rebellion in today's terms of identity, rebellion by gay people, lesbian people, and of course the burning current issue of trans people. How do you approach this, and particularly in terms of an international relations course, how do you place such rebellion within an international context, particularly as different cultures, different environments mean somewhat different takes on what this kind of rebellion and what these kinds of identity might entail. So this is something complex, not something to be sorted only from a Western perspective, not something that is in itself a form of identity colonialism. These are things that I want to address in future versions of this course, as I said, but there is something that can be said right now, and that is we were discussing last week the advent of ISIS, the depredations that ISIS caused in the Middle East, particularly in Syria and in Iraq, and the trail of atrocities that it left in its wake. Many of these atrocities were committed against women. So I wanted to start today's lecture with a recap, in part, of the role that women played in fighting back. And of course, this in itself is problematic, because there is a certain feminist discourse that regards all war as masculinist. When women fight back, are they partaking in a masculinist discourse and a masculinist practice? Or are they fighting back in their own rebellion against depredation, against atrocity, against insult, against denigration? What we had in the fight against ISIS, and this was most apparent in the battle for Mosul, was the advent of Kurdish armed forces, and particularly Kurdish female armed forces. The Peshmerga Kurdish forces deployed probably up to about 20,000, although it's almost impossible to get an accurate take on this figure. But about 20,000 women fighters. Now, these were not second line, second echelon troops. In the siege of Mosul, they took their turn on the front line. They rotated forwards when others were rested on the second line. They took their turn on the front line and were apparently extremely effective as frontline soldiers. There were some mixed battalions, men and women, but the women in single-sex battalions and brigades distinguished themselves. These were women who had a point to prove, first of all because their sisters had been treated abysmally, raped, killed. They had a point to prove in terms of their own families, who had been denigrated, abused, killed by ISIS. They needed to prove that they were just as capable of claiming justice by way of revenge, by way of establishing a Kurdish identity, not only the capacity of a female identity. That these women, mostly about the same age as you, played a very, very significant part in the battle for Mosul. As I said, taking their turns on the front line. They began in the first instance as a women's series of self-protection units, armed only with very, very old-fashioned and scavenged AK-47s. It was the flooding by President Obama of the region with modern weapons to aid and abet those who are going to fight against ISIS when he deemed it perhaps imprudent for American troops to become involved in this particular battle and series of battles. So weapons were sent, and the Peshmerga, including the women battalions, regiments, divisions, were able to benefit from this influx of modern weaponry, and they became quite a highly trained and formidable force in the battle for Mosul and in other battles. They used to boast that the most insulting thing, the most humiliating thing for an ISIS fighter would be to be killed by a woman, because of the ideology of ISIS fighters that very, very much regarded women as second-class citizens and as second-class human beings. So this idea of being able to take the fight forward against ISIS for a variety of reasons, gender being among them, the fight against sexism being among them, but many other things being in the mix as well, not to mention, of course, sheer basic protection of their communities and their families. All of these things were a feature of the final days of the war against ISIS in terms of its geopolitical identity as a caliphate. Of course, in terms of Western cynicism and in terms of Western utility, usefulness, and past your use-by date, underneath President Trump, the Kurds in general and the women fighters of the Kurdish armies were abandoned in the power politics of the region. This is something which is still having its reverberations in the region right now, but for a brief moment, what you had was the spectacle of Sunni Islamic women taking the fight to Sunni Islamic jihadist fundamentalists, for want of another word. Perhaps of even more poignant note was the brigade of Yazidi women who were mobilized in the fight against ISIS. This is not an Islamic community per se. They were regarded by ISIS as apostate, so it wasn't just a blue-on-blue firefight, Sunni Islam against Sunni Islam. This was Sunni Islam against apostates. Now, this is because the Yazidi community, although ethnically part of the Middle East and closely related to the Kurdish people, has a religion which is a syncretic one, part Islamic, certainly, part Christian in minor dimension, but also Zoroastrian, the ancient religion of Persia. And this conflation of beliefs, this syncretic religion, was regarded by ISIS as apostate. So essentially, there was an attempt at genocide against the Yazidi, an attempt to wipe out at least the male members of the Yazidi community, and to treat the women as sex slaves. And those women who were able to escape from this vowed revenge. And their revenge could be quite terrible. There was very little mercy shown to captured ISIS fighters. And you'll see how they distinguish themselves from Peshmerga Kurdish fighters. The badges they wore on their upper arm were similar to the Kurdish badges, but the Yazidi officers surmounted that badge with a skull. They were there to kill. They were there to kill for revenge. They too fought very well, And this brings into the frame of rebellion not only questions of gender, but the conflation of gender with religion, with other forms of identity in terms of ethnicity and nation, or aspirant nation, in terms of identity, in terms of religious syncretic belief, the freedom to believe from different quarters and different animations of what is right and what is sacred. All of these things made them into a very, very unusual group of people and a very unusual group of women. What caught the Western imagination, of course, was none of this, but very, very much, and I hesitate to say this, but in terms of the particularly American broadcasts of battles in which these women played often a major part, because many of them were blonde. And of course, what you have in the Middle East is a conflation of different ethnic influences dating back to the Crusades, when there were Christian crusader kingdoms in that part of the Middle East, stretching from Syria through to the edges of Kurdistan and Persia. And the descendants of the Crusaders, and this is evident primarily in Syria and Lebanon, but in many other parts as well, brought to the region people with different characteristics in terms of their appearances. But what this meant was that the Peshmerga fighters and the Yazidi fighters looked Western. And this attracted a very great deal of interest and a very great deal of sympathy, if not actually practical support, in fact, very little really practical support, to the complex conflation of causes for which these women fought. But it's interesting to understand how we had to reduce them in the first instance to a replica of ourselves. And the peculiarities of their agenda, their very courageous agenda, was often left in the wayside of not being fully understood. So you have one of these contradictions of the modern world, in which there is a partial cosmopolitanism, but also a partial non-cosmopolitanism. And I'll return to that in due course later on in this lecture. But of course, what you have is, in this region, throughout it, but in different ways, a cosmopolitanism which has partaken of influences from the outside world. One of the key figures of study in this course, Ali Shariati, the Iranian intellectual who went to Paris. It's important to remember that he went to Paris and he associated with the circle of existential philosophers that included female philosophers like Simone de Beauvoir. And what you had in the 1950s when he was studying there was a prefigure of what in the Anglophonic West began to capture the imagination only in the 1960s, and which was called in the first instance in the Anglophonic West women's liberation, later dignified by the term feminism. But this had really begun in the 1950s in France, particularly with the great book by Simone de Beauvoir, The Second Sex, basically making the claim, but elaborating it over several hundred pages, that a woman is not born, a woman is made. In other words, a woman is made to be an inferior, a subjugated species, a subspecies, if you like, of man, by a masculine environment, but that everyone in the first instance is born equal with equal capacity. The argument of being made rings throughout the book, The Second Sex, and in the lives of female philosophers like Simone de Beauvoir, who claimed the freedom of sexuality as well as the social and political freedoms entitled to them by virtue of their sex or irregardless of their sex. And what you had in the Paris that Shariati found herself in was, for want of another word, sexual experimentation writ large. In other words, what you had in terms of the fabled relationship between Simone de Beauvoir and Jean-Paul Sartre was, to all intents and purposes, what we would loosely call an open marriage. Uh, it's almost impossible to keep up with who was sleeping with whom at any one time, or whether both of them were sleeping with the same person at the same time, because there's a bisexuality involved as well in terms of Simone de Beauvoir. But this idea of being able to claim sexuality as being able to claim equality of the sexes was something which would have impacted very, very much upon Ali Shariati. And you didn't have to be a philosopher to be part of this circle, to behave in this kind of individuated freedom, whether you were a man or a woman, was something which was epitomized, for instance, by the singer Juliet Greco, who had the famous love affair with Miles Davis, the American black trumpeter who was escaping racism in the United States by coming to Paris. But the relationship between Greco and Miles Davis evoked no consternation in philosophical Paris. In fact, Jean-Paul Sartre asked Miles Davis, look, you love her so much, why don't you just marry her? To which Miles Davis said, but look, it would break her heart because the minute we went to America, she would be treated as a Negro's whore or a nigger's whore. And this would basically destroy her self-regard, being surrounded by people who would regard her in that manner. And indeed, the one time they did meet in America, she was treated in exactly that fashion. And that caused the end of the relationship. But what it meant was that you had, in this period in Paris, not only the idea germinating and beginning to flower of sexual equality and sexual freedom, but also of racial equality. It was the era, of course, where people like Fanon, people like Senghor were also studying in Paris, also intersecting with the philosophical circles of Paris. The famous idea of the melting pot of intellectual Paris was founded on these occasions and these conjunctures. So when Ali Shariati wrote one of his most famous short pieces called Fatma is Fatma, referring to the daughter of the Prophet, the daughter of Prophet Muhammad, and how she accompanied her father into battle and would rally the troops. The idea being that you couldn't identify Fatma as the daughter of the Prophet. You couldn't identify her as the wife of the husband she eventually married. You could only identify Fatma as Fatma, in other words, in terms of her achieved individual identity, which was every bit as important and as equal as the identity of anybody else. Now, when you read Shariati today, many of his writings seem very, very tame by today's standards. You have to recall that at the time he published these writings, these were extremely radical statements and positions that he was making and taking. So Fatma is very, very much a radical document of prototypical Iranian feminism. Prototypical because, of course, the revolution of 1979 has prevented the full feminism from being able to take, as it were, full charge of itself. The seeds are there. The prototypicality might become a typicality, and hopefully it will in the future. But the seeds of it really do owe to antecedents that go back to the 1950s. So what you have in terms of what might be possible in Iran, what seemed briefly possible on the battlefields of Syria and Iraq, what was briefly possible was an equality between men and women, born of struggle. Don't forget, as I said, the Kurdish Peshmerga fighters and the Yazidi female fighters were waging a bitter war against ISIS. There were no prisoners. What you had in the work by Ali Shariati, Fatma is Fatma, is an account of Fatma achieving her identity and her equality and her self-identity, her self-agency, by being at the side of Mohammedan battle. So you have here the whole notion of struggle and the whole notion of rebellion against subjugation becoming possible only in struggle which was militarized. This poses huge problematics for today's middle-class Western ethos. I won't go into that in great detail, but it does mean that in the emerging world, the emerging countries, what you often have is emergence through struggle, emergence through rebellion, in which violence is very, very often not only necessary but inescapable. This has been a theme in this course when we've talked about different forms of rebellion. All of these things have involved violence. You might be anti-violence, like the liberation theologists, but all the same, when your leaders, like Archbishop Romero, become assassinated, you are immersed in a violent situation. So violence becomes inescapable. It becomes part of rebellion, which is precisely why, at the very beginning of this course, we likened the ethics of rebellion to the ethics of war. So the justice of war in terms of its cause, the justice of war in terms of its conduct, these also apply in translated terms to our discussions about rebellion. But the analogy between war and rebellion is precisely an exact analogy, because rebellion so often involves violence. And in almost all the case examples that we've discussed, they certainly have involved violence. So we have, as it were, this link between philosophy, between war and the way that we regard war in terms of its justice, and in terms of the instances of violence and rebellion that have been part of this particular course. So you had, as it were, from the very beginning, a conflation, a fusion of influences. And these influences have always been drawn from across different cultures, different influences from different parts of the world. Just like you had in terms of liberation theology, a conflation between a certain religious view of what a truly Christological code of conduct should entail, and at the same time an analysis of the world in terms of its political economy which was neo-Marxist. Even in its attempt to be at its most peaceful and its most singular, these are priests preaching a certain theology which is meant to be Christian, you couldn't escape a conflation of influences. And of course, throughout the entire course, what you have were these cross-cutting influences. You had, for instance, in the American Revolution, all kinds of influences from the French Revolution. Thomas Paine was a figure who, in fact, on both sides of the Atlantic, he traveled back and forth, was a link, as it were, a human bridge between the two. The rights of man, of course, this meant the rights of everyone, enunciated by someone like Paine in the first instance, and which laid the foundation for the Declaration of Rights in the United States of America, was something which Paine had rehearsed in France. People like Lafayette fought in France, came to the United States to fight for the American Revolution in the United States. basically embodying values that were common to both sides of the Atlantic. And it's probably true to say, although of course received histories from the United States tend to downplay this, that the American ability to hold the British at bay, if not defeat them, probably owed in large strategic and critical part to the intervention of people like Lafayette and the armed forces and their training that he brought to the American theater. You look at the Russian Revolution, you're looking at the influence of a German thinker, Marx. You're looking at the exile that Marx and Engels had in, for instance, the United Kingdom. You're looking at a conflation of influences brought to bear, not always convincingly, within the Russian context, where, of course, Lenin had to invent something peculiar, that is the vanguard party, because none of his influences and what they said should happen would work. But what this meant was not a lack of influences, but a means of treating influences in part by their adaptation, if not in some ways their repudiation. Nothing comes out of a vacuum. And the Chinese Revolution, of course, was a conflation of thought from antiquarian time, allied with all kinds of modern thought about republicanism, all kinds of modern thought about individuality and equality. And of course, finally, in terms of what Mao had to do in order to achieve his victory, also, as in what was then the Soviet Union, a vanguard party, which remains pretty much the powerful force in today's China. But again, there was no Chinese revolution in an isolation from influences to do with the outside world. There was a very great deal that was extrinsic, trying to locate and trying to isolate what was peculiar and intrinsic only is to a very large extent a doomed exercise. And of course, we've seen in this course the rebellion of the Maoris in New Zealand. Finally, the rallying ideology and philosophy and the ethics of rebellion on the part of the Maoris was a conflation between traditional beliefs and Christian beliefs, a conflation that became an articulate syncretism, a religious syncretism, which identified the Maori people with the nation of Israel, chosen by God, destined by God to be delivered from the house of bondage in Egypt, that is European colonialism. And this image of a chosen people, blessed, chosen, and destined by God, a God drawn from his Christian origins and married to a sense of the Maori cosmos, meant that the authenticity of the uprising and rebellion, while apparent in part, was also balanced in other part by these influences from the outside universe. As I said, the Maori king, the first Maori king, the elected king, Patata I, very, very much looked at the apparatus by which the Europeans were successful in their government and in their military campaigns, and took the fundamental decision of trying to emulate them by trying to establish a Maori equivalent in government, so that the Maoris could be as organized governmentally and as organized militarily as the European oppressors. So being free from extrinsic influences, again, even in an isolated environment like that in New Zealand, was an impossible achievement. There was a cosmopolitanism at foot, a cosmopolitanism in which the terms of who took what from whom is difficult to decipher, perhaps, but all the same, the mixture is plain to see. And of course, when we came to the liberation of Africa, we had a very close look at the example of Kenneth Kaunda in Zambia, whose influences that ranged from Lasky and Tony, the social democratic progenitors of the Labour Party's idea of the welfare state in this country, the teachings of Mahatma Gandhi in terms of his pacifism, and the teachings of a certain Christian missionary view of a communal African society, which in the case of Kaunda's own ethnic background, that of the Bemba people, basically didn't exist. That so-called communality in the Bemba community was established on a certain feudalism which had its own slave-owning class and, of course, slaves, nobility and those who were not noble, those who did not have to work because they were noble, and those who had no chance of escaping the ardors and the travails of work. So the blending of unfortunate elements from one's history and one's traditions, the blending of them into something that is more acceptable in modern terms, was part of Kaunda's project, whether knowingly or reflexively. The Zambia of today represents the embodiment of many influences. It reflects a syncretic, a fused view of the world. It reflects a certain cosmopolitanism. And of course, this is very, very much apparent in other theaters. In the uprising of the black slaves in Haiti, Toussaint Louverture basically took upon himself the characteristics and the attempted personality of Napoleon. The whole idea of military rulers around the world ever since Napoleon has essentially been to emulate Napoleon and to claim his ethics. And that is the man on horseback is able to bring progress of an enlightened sort to each nation. Of course, this has been very seldom the case, sometimes certainly, but more often than not, the opposite happens. But all the same, the reaching for an image, the reaching for an influence, the reaching for a validation from another time, from another culture, basically from elsewhere, something which is not contaminated by the hypocrisies and the difficulties of the in here, allow a certain purity for the rebellion or the revolution, which would not have been possible if it had been drawn only from an individual national or cultural history. I think that you'll find very few examples that escape the necessity of this conflation. So even when you look at something that seems at first sight to be desirable, if desirable and possible only in isolated locations, like Paulo Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed, something which should be able to work in an isolated village, for instance. The minute you try to write that into a larger environment, then it becomes almost impossible to do without external influences because you'll be dealing with external fight back, external repression and suppression, which has to be grappled with and fought against in terms that can defeat that external oppression, suppression, repression. And I think the key example of that, and we discussed this in part of our course, the key example of that is the intervention of the Zapatistas in the uprising in Chiapas province in Mexico. This became not just an expression of grievance and rebellion on the part of the indigenous Indians in Chiapas, but it became fused with metropolitan thought, led by people like Subcomandante Marcos of the Zapatistas, academic thought about the international political economy, and a certain thought to do with warfare by theatre and symbol that could be broadcast. In other words, the minute you begin to integrate transnational technology into the equation, then all attempts at a unique and an isolated and a pure individuality and authenticity and autarky, an autochthonous sense of rebellion, becomes diluted, if not becomes impossible. And that is, of course, the very, very nature of the contradiction within ISIS. We discussed last week in detail, and I've certainly tried to go into detail in my book, Spear to the West, about the mastery of ISIS in terms of the internet, in terms of the dark web, in terms of the recruitment scenarios and methodologies using the web, both the open web and the dark web, and the progression from one to the other, the articulation of a persuasive outreach that would lead not only to belief, but to action upon that belief founded on a deontology, a self-sacrifice. All of these things and the command of the technology, the terrain of the electronic sphere, show a huge interpenetration of what is represented in some ways as antiquarian but still righteous belief with modernity as its vehicle for delivery. And of course, the very composition of ISIS and its fighting force, drawn from many nationalities, including many parts of the West, point to a cosmopolitanism in itself, finding, perhaps, some kind of unity in fighting for a common cause or fighting against a common enemy. All the same, what you had on the battlefield in the configuration of the ranks of ISIS is a mixed group of people brought together by modern means to fight for a cause which, as I said last week, is somehow slightly more conservative than what it appears at first sight, and that is a caliphate as a geopolitical entity. Nothing in the ether about this in terms of its first conception, but of a state among other states, only not a Westphalian state, to achieve that by violence, to propagate it by belief, and from that kind of foundation, then to reach out to the rest of the world. How they would expect to do that, if by violent means and not be subject to retribution, is a question which can now not be answered. But what all of these things mean is that it's impossible now to typecast anybody. You just can't say a fundamentalist. You just can't say jihadist. What do they mean? These simple terms, these generic terms, these reductionist terms do not allow any kind of interrogation as to the mixture of beliefs, the mixture of methodologies, and the mixtures that go into the execution of a project, all of which involve so many different influences, techniques, and above all, thought processes. So don't forget, when you talk about al-Baghdadi, he was meant to be the first founder of ISIS. Al-Baghdadi simply means the man of Baghdad. As far as we know, he has a PhD from the University of Baghdad. It differs as to whether or not it's in engineering or whether it's in theology. If in engineering, then obviously a sophisticated person in terms of his knowledge of technological matters. However, what is interesting here is that when you look at the age of al-Baghdadi, he basically grew up at exactly the same time that the internet was growing up. He wasn't a stranger to it. It was part and parcel of his coming of age. He came of age as the internet came of age. He didn't have to strain himself to understand the capacity of the electronic medium. Some of our politicians have certainly had to strain to understand this. Tony Blair, for instance, as Prime Minister, couldn't do his own emails. So you had a very, very, let us say, striking advantage on the part of people who were instantly denigrated as backward, as antediluvian, antiquarian, and as fundamentalist. But in many ways, their understanding of the modern world was greater than that of their Western antagonists. But the uses of this knowledge and the, as it were, weightings of this knowledge within the ISIS movement meant always an agenda which could not be put forward in straightforward terms. Could there be a caliphate that necessarily was more modern than most other states in terms of its electronic organization, in terms of its capacity electronically to move money, in terms of its capacity electronically to equip the revolution and perhaps later its defense? All of these things mean that you have an uneasy alliance, perhaps, between what is possible in terms of belief and what is possible in terms of the propagation and execution of belief. These contradictions, I think, bestride all of the great events of recent history. So when we look at the Arab Spring, what you're looking at is an uprising which was almost successful, which was established by electronic organization against the huge military might of the Egyptian militarized establishment. We had citizens who were able to circumvent the countermeasures of the Egyptian military government by organizing themselves on Facebook, on Twitter, using their cell phones, etc., etc. And even though the Arab Spring was in the end unsuccessful, and the Egyptian edition of it finally unsuccessful, what you had was that the Egyptian military had to sacrifice its own military leader, Mubarak, imprison him, and basically prosecute and persecute their own. What this did was to establish something to do with not so much a triumph for the popular will, but at least the pressures that the popular will can bring if the popular will is mobilized in a certain way that involves very, very modern technological electronic means. So the nature of rebellion is necessarily electronicized these days. This is something which is a feature of almost everything that goes on. Part of the tracking of Osama bin Laden was by satellite efforts to track his cell phone presence in different parts of Afghanistan and then later Pakistan. The visibility of yourself by your use of modern means of communication could also mean the means of your betrayal by exactly electronic surveillance. Which is more cosmopolitan than the other? What is cosmopolitan anymore? The battle over Huawei, the Chinese telecommunications provider, which we see being enacted right now. Who controls the intersections of reality, physical, and reality, cyber? Who controls that? Who is able to build the software and the hardware and is able to accomplish this? Who controls access to most of the rare minerals and metals that allows the handsets, the computers to be built? Who manufactures the most laptops in the world? The answers to all of those questions is China, I hasten to add. But it establishes a new variation of the old Cold War that is all the same fought for control of the electronic means of communication an organization, which again means a control of the interpenetration of culture, thought, and belief of one society by another, which basically means a struggle, a battle for control of cosmopolitanism, which means that there is one theme and one problematique that emerges from this cause. The theme is that there's no rebellion, there's no revolution, that is not cosmopolitan. Everything, everyone has partaken in an international commons. They may interpret things in certain ways, use, misuse, abuse certain influences, marry them, render them, as it were, local in one way or another, a combination of global and local. How that's done, the manner in which it's achieved, the ratios that are involved, all of these things are subjects to discussion, but there are ratios involved. So the need to be able to do this in order to establish one's own credentials for rebellion means that the world cannot be ignored in terms of the struggles and the rebellions and the efforts to create a different form of world of today. In the case of ISIS, what you had in terms of the messaging, in terms of the technology, in terms of the effort to narrow cosmopolitanism in terms of its doctrinal form to a very narrow vision of the international Islamic community, while not living up to that true internationalism by persecuting anybody who was even slightly outside the pale, the war between ISIS and the Kurdish Peshmerga being a case in point, what you had was not only that kind of narrowness, but you had therefore a battle between a true cosmopolitanism, with all its difficulties and different ratios, and an ersatz, or a false cosmopolitanism, in which it is thought that one could use outside influences purely for one's own ends, and subject to one's own means. So that when I write about the end of certainty, and this is a book that I wrote some years ago now, it is about to be reissued in a third edition, and that will be published by Bloomsbury Publishing sometime in 2021. It became one of the Guardian's books of the year in the year of its release. What I tried to do in that particular book was to say, look, there are no certainties one way or the other, anywhere, anyhow now, and that all attempts at, for instance, games theory, when we return to the problems of my old friend James Diderian and the American generals, one of their problems was to ascribe ascertainable definitive weightings to each of the actors in the games they were playing. Because if you can quantify the weights within the value systems of an actor, then you can also quantify, hopefully, what it is that they would be able to bear losing and what it is that they might be satisfied with in terms of partial winnings. So the idea of being able to ascribe weightings, weights, and definitions to your actors was something which was absolutely intrinsic and inescapable in games theory, which almost every military, not just the American military, plays in terms of its battle and war simulations. The minute you take away that capacity for definitive weights and weightings, the minute you ascribe uncertainty to each of these things, the whole premise of games theory collapses, which means that almost all wargaming in today's modern world becomes a fantasy, which means that what we might have are incredibly sophisticated enemies, as we describe them, and a militarized response, a securitized response, which is wanting in terms of an analogous sophistication, which means the title for my book, The End of Certainty, not just that the world has become more uncertain, but our responses to the difficulties of the world have also become more uncertain. How do we deal with a world like that? How do we grapple with the end of certainty? Well, the idea of a SOAS in its modern form, at least, probably something which has gathered momentum in the last 40, maybe being generous, 50 years, is that the only way that you can grapple with this kind of world is by studying all of its parts in equal measure and with equal value. That's very, very hard, and it's very difficult to be able to sustain that in today's world of financial difficulties and constraints. It's not amazing at all that in a world of underfunded universities, the mission of SOAS, as it's today configured, is not exactly the most highly valued. What we call the STEM subjects, science, technology, engineering, medicine, are valued way ahead of anything the SOAS might have to offer. And things to do with economics, although we have an economics faculty, of course, things to do with management, we have a sort of business school. Those are things which take priority in terms of how governments configure their visions of how governance of the future should occur. Something to do with mutual understanding, by being able to understand on their terms all of the very different and differing and contradictory component parts. That is something which has yet to see any full realization, any full financing, any full acceptance in terms of how games theory, how strategic analyses, etc. are conducted in today's world. There's always a plan. There's a plan to invade almost everyone, everything. Just needs to be updated according to the circumstances. Not always very accurate, as we found in the cases of Libya, Iraq, twice over. Where do we get it wrong? I had a talk once, many, many years ago, to an old colleague at the University of Kent. When I was young, he was a very distinguished professor, John Davies. He went on to become Master of All Souls College at Oxford. And he was then the key international authority, partly by virtue of being the only international authority, on the cultural origins of Gaddafi's Libyan revolution. And I was talking to John Davis and I said, but look, in terms of your own book, everyone has misunderstood this. He might be atrocious, but he's still misunderstood. And he said, yes, people don't get that these are two different things, judging someone because he's atrocious, and something different in terms of being able to understand that person who is atrocious. We still make that mistake everywhere, almost every single time in today's world. And we are mistaken, as I said, if we think there are single animations, single causes for rebellion. The problematique, as I close this last lecture, is that we also often misunderstand whether or not there is a single way of conducting rebellion. What if, in many cases, just conduct in rebellion is impossible? What if you have to be atrocious in turn and hope that the values that drove you to rebellion or war in the first instance can remain intact? Let me return to the Yazidi women. ISIS attempted genocide upon the male members of the community. They raped, they kept as sex slaves the female members of the Yazidi community. The women who survived, who mobilized into a fighting brigade, as I said, wore a skull on their upper arm patches. They were there for revenge. I understand that there were many summary executions conducted by them on captured ISIS fighters. Was this just conduct in war? Was this understandable, if not fully just, retribution? Was this just in terms of a balancing of the scales? Was this just in terms of some perhaps being more guilty than others? Perhaps some of those executed had not killed or raped anyone. Maybe they'd been completely incompetent as a fighter and completely unatrocious in terms of their individual action. But does it mean that they're partaking in a common cause that involved that kind of activity of killing and raping? Does that make them equally guilty with the others who did participate physically in such killing, such raping? No trial, no self-defense, no possibility of exoneration, no possibility of clemency or of some kind of conditionality in terms of being punished or not. And yet I don't think any of us finds it in our hearts to blame these women and to say they were not just. So although there are many questions to be asked about just war and just rebellion in terms of causes, why we go to war, why we go towards rebellion, there are still many questions to be posed in terms of the conduct, righteous, unrighteous, just, unjust, justified, inescapable in terms of the conduct of rebellion. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's been a wonderful course. You've actually been a wonderful group of students. Thank you very, very much for putting up with my peccadilloes and eccentricities. It's very, very difficult. I'm sure that you'll give me some, as well, sympathy for having to do these things online. I know it's been difficult for you to watch these things online. Some of you may have noticed that halfway through some of these lectures, my eyes have been weeping. That's because of the glow of the screen. You're not making me cry. You're all absolved of that. I think that you've done very well in terms of coming through a difficult term. As I say, I'm really, really happy with the efforts that you've made, and I look forward to seeing you again this coming Thursday for our final discussion in this course. So thank you very much.